Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back, everyone. Another week has gone by, and it's time for the Anthony Patch Show right here on Truth Frequency Radio, TFRlive.com. It does not seem like 1 week already since I was here co-hosting for Anthony Patch. I am, of course, Kev Baker. I'm the co-host for the next 2 hours, and you're all here to hear Mr. Patch and what show he has got lined up for you tonight. Remember, you can check out his work over at anthonypatch.com. And Tony, as I always do, welcome to your own show.
You're such a comedian. I can't do it without you, my friend. You're always good at bringing us on the air and working through some of the technical burps that we deal with. So this is fantastic. We have a great show lined up for tonight. We have 2 hours with one of our great friends, Dane Wigington from Geoengineering and geowatch.org, and he has some latest information that he's going to bring to us today because, like Kevin myself, he's a deep researcher, and I will turn it over to you, Dane. Go right ahead and give us your introduction on the latest breaking news that you have from your organization.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Kev. And as we enter this particular chapter in time on our planet, there are so many converging cataclysms related to the biosphere that it's truly difficult to keep up. And you too certainly have taken note of the theater going on in the U.S. in the last week, correct? The Trump power structure orchestrated. And we have different sides of this power structure, and that doesn't mean any one of them is benign or benevolent, but the theater they create catches everybody up in this distraction, causing them to not focus on the wider horizon, which is where they need to keep their eyes. All of these other goings-on mean nothing in the bigger picture. Planet doesn't support life. That's the end of the road for all of us. So everywhere we look, Anthony and Kevin, we see collapse, ecosystem collapse, massive die-off. We have forest fires raging around the globe, grave implications from that. And so many of these roads, although anthropogenic activity has decimated the planet, and when I frame that question in a particular way, Anthony and Kev, no one can really rationally argue that. Even those that feel there's nothing wrong with the climate or the planet, when you point out to them that, can we really say we've been good stewards of the planet? The answer is obviously no. Climate engineering being at the top of the poor steward list and the epitome of human insanity, and so many of the unfolding cataclysms, we can say at minimum are being radically fueled by climate engineering.
Well, thank you for that introduction on that, Dane. Geoengineeringwatch.org is where you can find all of his research. And Dane, I've been following your work for at least 10 years now. When I used to live in Portland, Oregon, I used to listen to you very often, frequently. And I often thought, gee, I'd like to come down to Redding, California and, hang out with you for a little bit. So it's great having you on the air with our audience. Our audience appreciates your efforts. You're one of the very few that is truly both a deep researcher from a professional standpoint, as well as being willing to be outspoken and in essence, make yourself a target for those that don't want this information out. And you're right, it is a huge distraction. One of the things that you have been talking about that I find to be a relatively new discussion is this whole topic of CDR, the CO2 removal. And if you could, and I don't want to take away from your agenda, from your list of what you want to talk about, but if now or later on in your presentation, because we have 2 hours to just kind of relax and talk about wherever you want to go, somewhere in here I'd like to talk about what CO2 removal is, because I'm hearing that the CO2 levels actually are getting precipitously low in terms of supporting plant life.
I don't doubt that you may have seen some headlines like that, but I would probe deeper into wherever they came from, because we have so much data from so many different directions to say the contrary. For example, the nutrition in pollen that bees are uptaking is declining rapidly because of excess CO2. We have ocean ecosystems, most specifically, are becoming extremely saturated with excess CO2. Thus, we have the acidification of the oceans. We have many biomarkers, if you will, to confirm what we know must be happening, because the explanation of this gas is coming from everywhere at this point, from the forest burning to the ground, from the 4 billion gallons of hydrocarbon we burn a day. And the downstream disruption it causes when changes happen this quickly is very cataclysmic. And we have the other greenhouse gases, of course, nitrous oxide, methane. And although CO2 contents have been very much higher in the past, there's no question about that. And the planet was actually thriving during some of those epochs. Mm-hmm. But those came on very slowly, Anthony. And what we have now mathematically, statistically, is happening 170 times faster than any previous epoch. Nothing can adapt with this sort of speed. Nothing can adapt. So, and this is where people need to consider, we have a more stable temperature here compared to Venus, where one side of the planet is cooking, and you have shaded areas on the back, and you have this holding in of the heat because of the greenhouse gases. When you thicken that up, obviously you have to have a warmer temperature. And and to point back at the more significant aspects that are not being discussed by the entire climate science community, and this is where their betrayal of the human race is most revealed. One, we have all of academia and all of the climate science community not mentioning climate engineering, the single greatest disrupting factor, not the only destructive factor, but the single greatest disruptive factor, not even discussing that. And they don't include, Anthony or Kev, any climate feedback loops in any of their modeling. How can that be? How can they call themselves science? There's no question the climate science community is betraying the human race with such omissions. But in regard to the fact that there are serious ramifications from the excess greenhouse gas buildup, and there's a number of greenhouse gases, again, so much focus is on CO2 and nothing on methane. And we're not talking about calflatulence. We're talking about formerly frozen methane deposits that are now spewing into the atmosphere. Anthony and Kev, have you two seen the blowouts called pingos in Siberia, the methane blowouts? Have you seen those craters?
Yeah, I've been following them for quite a while, actually, Dane. They're quite horrendous.
They are. And I would hope your listeners might take a look at that as well. If they search methane craters Siberia, they'll be shocked at what they see. And the latest statistic, there's about 7,000 of those either having already erupted or going to erupt. And the methane expulsion on the seafloor is much worse still. So I think we need to consider that this is not about Al Gore or carbon credit shams. It's simply about real damage done to the planet, which climate engineering is making far worse, not better.
Dane, one of the things that is sort of my pattern or my method to my madness is to hit the punchline at the beginning and then work backwards to support it. And so I'll cut to the chase here. Man is doing this. This is all man-made. We see the aircraft. We see the spraying in the air. We've discussed at length about the components of what they're spraying. To what end? If this is a planet inhabited by humans, and humans are involved in this activity, which seems to be self-destructive, to what end? To what purpose are they doing this? Is this, if we go out into the world of woo, if we go out in the world of conjecture, is this about supporting a new race of beings? Or to be more pragmatic and perhaps more scientific about it, is this really an effort to sustain life, to somehow prevent, as they're saying, global warming, but as you have discussed at length, this rebound effect that we're caught up in an endless loop of? In short, to what end? What is their purpose in doing all of this damage?
It's a very complex answer to that question, and certainly it's the most common question people ask. If we go backward, let's look at the destructive behavior of all empires. And at this point, it would be difficult not to admit to the fact that we are being run by various empires, the U.S. empire being at the top of the list. And have they not all eventually extinguished themselves, just as all cancers do? An empire is a form of cancer. And all those order followers that go along with Empire are all a part of the cancer, whether actively or passively. So if we look at the motives behind this, there are many. It all comes down ultimately to the quest for total dominance. And Anthony and Kev, you guys know that there are various military documents that state quite clearly that is the goal, full spectrum dominance of planet Earth. You know such documents exist, correct?
You bring that term up, Dane, because that's actually the title that Anthony chose for tonight. And we've been doing a series of shows now, Tony, and we're building up the bigger picture of what all this full spectrum dominance, all the individual facets of that are.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. We're bringing in the computers and, particle physics and all that stuff. But tonight, Dane is bringing in the more visible part of it and the one that is more widespread. Go ahead, my friend.
Well, and for most people, what we try to do at geoengineeringwatch.org is to stick to the most inarguable, verifiable, and alarming building blocks of the issue. Because for the vast majority of the population, as you two know all too well, if the equation becomes too complex, they shut down and go about their life and walk away. And we want them to get through the door. And once people get through the door and realize this is going on, it's real, I can't escape from it, I have to face it, those that are capable will certainly go further into the rabbit hole. But back to the motives behind this and the motives of empire that eventually lead to total collapse. And that's exactly what we have happening here. I think we all know that, with almost no exceptions, the members of the human race, except those that are living subsistence lifestyles, we're all contributing. If we're participating in the industrialized society in any way, shape, or form, we're contributing in a sense to a paradigm that was never sustainable. And those in power are certainly bear immense responsibility for helping to orchestrate this paradigm and helping to ensure the population would follow this paradigm. But if we trace back to the quest for more expansion, more industrialization, more GDP, continuing to consume nature for a profit, how long can that go on? And we have people in power who want to sustain that paradigm to the last possible moment and expand their power in every possible way. That leads to climate engineering. If we look at government documents, and we have many of those, some 750 pages long, they can all be found at geoengineeringwatch.org. They state clearly that those in power felt it was not only an option to decide where it rained too much, where it didn't rain enough, who should be drier, who should be wetter. They felt it was an obligation to some degree to intervene and orchestrate the weather. And again, it's about power and control. So when we have that kind of mentality with no regard for the consequences of their actions, even to themselves, and that's psychoanalysis bears that out with psychopathic behavior, that's a common thread. So when we have them trying to ionize the atmosphere for various environmental modification, DARPA weapons, increase over-the-horizon radar, weather warfare, we have the attempt to mask the severity of climate destruction that's already underway while inflicting even more destruction at the same time. In essence, trying to keep the empire expanding, trying to hide the severity of the consequences from the public for as long as possible, trying to keep business as usual, trying to use weather warfare as a covert weapon. All of these. It's a very complex answer, but ultimately, guys, I think if we relate it back to a cancer, does a cancer intend to kill the host? No, the host always dies because the cancer proliferates with no comprehension as to the consequences. It's a headless, heartless, soulless beast, as is empire.
Let me ask you this question then. We're kind of drilling down. Where do you see the end point for humanity if these guys as humans are involved and it is self-destructive? And I think you and I have agreed on this before, that we've already reached and surpassed the tipping point because of the damage that's been done. We're kind of on this backside of the bell curve at this point. Where do you see the end point in terms of how much more can the planet tolerate, and thereby how much more can the human race tolerate before we actually face the obvious effects of an extinction level event being manifest by people dying off?
Mass die-off is already here. We have tens of millions of people dying off right now around the globe, and it's not being covered. And food stocks, crops are crashing in multiple locations around the globe. The ocean, which is a massive primary source of protein for many people in many continents, countries, we have ocean aquatic ecosystems collapsing as well. And this will accelerate radically. Once the dominoes in the chain start to fall, that unraveling accelerates rapidly. On a time horizon, Anthony and Kev, mathematically speaking, it would appear that we would have on the current course less than a decade in the northern hemisphere before the planet may likely not support life. And I know that's a very short time horizon. Many will roll their eyes and walk away. I challenge those people who would rather ram their heads in the sand than face reality to look at the statistics, to look at the truth, to look at the trajectory of where we are right now, the amount of species loss, current daily species extinctions. There's no question we're that close. There's no question. If we remain on this course, if collapse happens in a manner, in a totality, that alters that course and shuts down some of the destructive activity like climate engineering and other industrialized activities, we're destroying the planet at a pace that can't be comprehended. If that stopped, perhaps we may salvage something of the planet. We're in uncharted territory right now. And when I refer to other destructive behavior, Anthony and Kev, I'm talking about things like, for example, the U.S. military destroying marine life all over the globe, west coast of North America, east coast, and other remote locations, using depleted uranium for practice, and completely, at least the Navy's PR rep, which I spoke to myself, completely oblivious to the ramifications of that, using munitions that has a 4.5 billion year, billion with a B, half-life. What sort of insanity is going on? And there are sonar applications grounding whales all over the globe. They're completely out of control. If this is not reined in immediately, if there's not a complete change of direction, mathematically speaking, statistically speaking, we have no chance for the near-term horizon. And however shocking this may be to your listeners, how can I say anything else? You brought up a few minutes ago, Anthony, that my outspokenness may make me a target. Is anybody any safer than me if the entire ship is going down?
No, very true. Very true. Go ahead, Kev.
You know, listening to this, I mean, Tony, we often talk about Elon Musk and his desire to colonize Mars. Recently, he's also been doing this tunneling thing underneath LA and everywhere else, and it really paints that in a different light now when you hear the urgency that's attached to what's going on the planet.
And let's consider this, Kev, with Musk and with others who put forth these ideas that we're going to terraform and colonize another planet like Mars. Every single rocket we launch further destroys our atmosphere. Look at the paradox of destroying our own planet, a once thriving planet, very recently, with the completely delusional notion that we're going to fly somewhere else on a planet that's already lifeless and somehow turn it into the Garden of Eden. This is total delusional thinking. So much of the human race has seen too many sci-fi movies, and they have no grasp of reality. They have no connection to the natural world, no connection. And we see this even in America, especially with some of the more affluent sectors of our society. People who, in San Francisco or some of the other big metropolitan areas, feel they're somehow isolated from whatever happens in the rest of the world. And this couldn't be further from the truth. And that realization is going to come home and face them in a way that few can imagine yet. But this notion that the fate of nature is somehow separate from our fate is a delusional notion. And ultimately, indeed, isn't it true and inarguable that man's war against nature is a war against ourselves? Is it not?
It is. So let's go to the solution side, and we'll continue to add more details. You have an audience that is well up to speed on your information. As Kev mentioned, he, with a lot of other guests, covers a lot of this information from different angles, different perspectives. And I appreciate your research because you pull together so many other researchers and disciplines under your umbrella. And, you know, people can find your work at geoengineeringwatch.org. and there's a lot of resources available there. So I encourage people to go there that are not quite up to speed on this topic, but the majority of our demographics, Dane, understand what you're talking about. So we shift over to the solution direction. We have about 5 minutes, and we'll pick it up on the other side because this is a long answer, I think, that will come from you. But what do we do about it? How do we make this happen to turn the tide of what is happening to our planet?
We force the issue to the full light of day. And I would argue if we can do that, if we can put that hole in the dam, there will be no stopping this issue from being brought to a halt. But we must do that, and that effort takes every single one of us. And short of that effort, because I hear people say we need to have a 1 million person march in such and such a city, that's not going to happen because people are not yet ready to face the fact that this is a fight for life. They're not going to show up to that march yet. But for now, all of us, if we arm ourselves with credible, verifiable data, straightforward data, visual imagery and so forth, like what we talked about off air, pamphlets, flyers, but credible data, and pass that on without going into long rants about facts and figures that you may not be familiar with and thus losing credibility. But if we all help start spot fires of awareness and we fuel those fires and have others do the same, we will soon enough reach all the military personnel, all their families, all the agency people. And when the families of those people realize what their family member is a part of, actually contributing, whether actively or passively, to global planetary omnicide, we have a chance of bringing this issue to light when people realize they're fighting for their lives. So I'll stop there because I know we're short on time. But the bottom line is we must each learn how to be effective and efficient in helping to sound the alarm and reaching critical mass and forcing this issue to the light of day.
All righty. Well, we have about 4 minutes, so we'll go ahead and continue on with that train of thought. And I want to ask you, you mentioned the families of those that are involved, whether they're in the military or in the industrial sector of what's going on, of essentially applying these chemicals into our atmosphere. And it goes beyond that. But do you get a sense that the people that are involved, that the families are being held hostage to force these frontline actors to continue their behavior?
Not at all. Most are all too willing to participate for a paycheck and a pension. An example of that, I just returned from a marine lab on the California coast. I've been there numerous times. The NOAA individual I was attempting to connect with was not there, and I was informed by other staff members that that individual, whom I have passed on data to, who was receptive, although the NOAA members and National Weather Service are all under an illegal federal gag order, Anthony and Kev. So we have illegal gag orders on our climate scientists and weather personnel, which should be a glaring red flag by itself. But I was informed, again, by a staff member that this NOAA member had lost his grant for atmospheric aerosol testing. That shouldn't be a surprise, given if he showed any inclination to investigate what was going on, his ability to investigate is simply stripped from him. And the other staff member that was speaking to me, and this is the kind of order follower that is all too willing to participate, was clearly irritated that I was there, didn't really want to communicate, and was more concerned about some paperwork she had to shuffle around than finding out the latest news about just how long we have left on our planet to survive. And that sort of willful blindness is why we're in this dark corner. And how many people do we know, without any outside pressure, they censor themselves. They all know how long their leash is, and they don't go to the end of it. And I know USDA scientists, U.S. Forest Service scientists, CAL FIRE, I know they're top entomologists. These people all self-censor. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to have any risk to their own personal comfort zone bubble. And they simply go along. They all help the power structure while the ship is going down. And that's what we need to cure. All of these people bear responsibility, and especially in the media, especially the media that's completely censoring any of this data. All of them should be held legally and morally accountable. And when we communicate with these people, we should send open emails and CC as many prominent societal members as we can with those communications, passing on credible data to media, agency people, and letting them know that the public is waking up. And when they do wake up and find out that this personnel that this message is going to, whoever it may be, was complacent, and that they are thus, by their complacency, accessories to the crime, we should let them know that. And that has to be phrased very carefully so that it's not a threat. It's simply a statement of fact. The public certainly will hold them responsible once they fully awaken, and they should be made aware of that. And such means some of these people will begin to question exactly what they're involved with, and their family members will eventually find out.
All right. Let's pick that up after the break. Go ahead and Kev, take us out. Kev, are you there?
I would be
All right.
if I could actually find my mute button, Tony. How amateur was that? Can't believe it. But folks, we are right on the break. But don't panic, because we've still got another 3 sections to go with Dane Wigington. You can find him over at geoengineeringwatch.org. Don't forget, coming right up after tonight's Anthony Patch show, you guessed it, Freaky Friday will be live right here on TFR Live. So no need to go anywhere tonight at all. 3 short minutes. We'll be back. Thanks for listening.
This is the Truth Frequency Radio Network.
We are TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
All right, welcome back. My guest and Kev's guest, Dane Wigington from Geoengineeringwatch.org. And we're talking about what is being done to literally kill us off on a global scale. And this is well along. All of you know this. You've heard this. We're talking about the details. We're going to get into terminology, the semantics of what is being bandied about in the popular mainstream that is saying very little, but they tend to use the wrong terms. We talked about the self-censoring that goes on within the world of the researchers, the communicators that should be communicating to us what's going on in our environment, but are failing to because they're self-censoring for fear of loss of funding, their grants, their military-industrial complex source of funding. And, you know, we've talked about the universities becoming nothing more than just a military environment, that the militarization of the universities is now in full force, and we're seeing that. That's why much of this information never reaches what I call Joe Bag of Donuts walking down the street, never knows anything about it, never bothers to look up in the sky to see what's going on because they're too busy with their phones. Anyway, that whole discussion you've all heard before, and we're trying to get into the specifics, and Dane is going to share with us data that comes from NASA. We're going to talk about UV levels. We're going to get into what's going on in Antarctica with respect to this topic tonight. The sea level rising, what's going on with those measurements, why, what's the mechanism. But again, things like chemtrails, that is like the CIA back in the 60s and 70s labeling people like Kev Baker and myself as conspiracy theorists. It's become such a pejorative label that anytime somebody drops that label on a researcher, people in the general public will just disavow and disregard anything that you say beyond that, even if you bring up hard facts and evidence. They don't want to hear it because you've been labeled. And that's much the same as when you hear the label chemtrails. So from that word, that terminology, Dane, share with us your backstory on that name, chemtrails.
Well, again, I know many people are unsatisfied that I continue to bring this to the surface, but it's imperative that people understand how harmful that term is to our cause. If you're discussing this issue with a friend and not trying to introduce it to an agency official or a media person, whatever term you use is irrelevant. But when you're trying to gain traction in this fight, credibility, it's imperative you use the science terms and bypass the programmed knee-jerk response that comes from all media people, all agency people, all elected officials. All of them are trained to completely disregard you when you use that term. And I just went through this again. I meet with a lot of agency people and officials, and I just did about 2 weeks ago. And for 2 of those meetings, it took me about half the time I had with these individuals to get them past that term, because they had already associated that with my data presentation to them, and I had to get them around that term before they would look at fact one. Why would we be self-destructive in this effort? And on the term chemtrails, and Kev, or Anthony and Kev, on the term chemtrails, if we look at what some cling to try to justify the use of that term, they cling to an Air Force manual that's a basic chemistry lab introduction for Air Force cadets, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with aerosol climate engineering, geoengineering, solar radiation management, nothing whatsoever. So there is virtually no scientific basis in the term chemtrails, even though it fits with what we see in the sky. Nobody argues that. But again, if we're attempting to slay this foe of the military-industrial complex, we have to play effectively and conduct ourselves effectively, and using the science terms and bypassing the programmed responses from these people is essential. So for those that haven't read, and Anthony, I think you said you had heard of that manual before, correct?
Yes, I have, and it's been brought up by a number of other people who did not have the backstory that you're sharing with us.
Well, I would challenge anybody, read that manual. And so many people are not actually researching anything. They see a cover of that manual and they run with it because someone else did a story who also didn't research, and everybody's running down the road with nobody having a clear compass heading as to where they're going and why and on what justification. That has to end. We can't just keep taking off with whatever headlines dangle before us. We have to have some clue what sort of information we're passing on, and does that information lead to other credible information? That's why we keep things so watertight at geoengineeringwatch.org. We want solid, credible, verifiable data that you can confidently refer somebody to and not have a big gaping hole in the bottom of the ship because there's some post that had no scientific relevance to it or factuality. So it's imperative. Credibility is imperative. You guys know that.
Yeah, and I appreciate your methodology because it mirrors and parallels what Kev Baker and I do, and that is always drilling down, always defining, always going to the sources, reading the published white papers, going to the university peer-reviewed papers, and looking at the research that's going on. And whether we're talking about particle physics, we're talking about quantum computing and artificial intelligence, or DNA modification, we are always citing sources, always going to the facts and figures, doing our best to reduce fear by providing that information. That is exactly what you're doing. I applaud you, Dane, for your methodology. It is scientifically and empirically based and removes a lot of the nonsense that I call it YouTube land. YouTube has a lot of great information. You can learn a lot, but there's a lot of garbage. And what the garbage does is generate fear. We are not here, you and I, the three of us, talking in terms of generating fear. We're talking about providing facts and figures and then providing a direction to apply solutions. So let me ask you just a very 30,000-foot elevation perspective, and that's a term that Kev and I have been using for a couple of months now that I think is appropriate with your discussion. But from 30,000 feet, are there more of us, say the good guys, and the general population of the world I categorize as the good guys? Are there more of us than there are the bad guys?
That's a hard question to answer because how do we define good or bad? The Stoic philosophers would say no mind is willingly deprived of the truth. When people behave in certain manners, if they truly knew what was truly good for them and the whole, perhaps they wouldn't do what they do. And when we have what societies would perceive as good, upstanding people, like some of the scientists I know with certain agencies who know this is going on and who refuse to help in any way, shape, or form while the entire planet goes down and while all of us inhale this toxic material with every breath, and they're doing exactly nothing, is not their complacency a form of tyranny? I would argue that it is. And so it's hard to define at this point that question. And I don't know that I would want to attempt to answer it.
That's okay.
We have a society that would choose to, and I hear this all the time, that it's not society's fault. It's only the few elite at the top. And I would argue that point. I don't argue how bad those are at the top, but I would argue that if we have facilitated this current paradigm and participated with it and continue to go along with it, they couldn't, if we didn't do that, they couldn't do what they do. The same with our military brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
How do we sidestep out of it then? If we say, and we reach out, let's say we have an audience of 10 million people that we're speaking to right now, which I wish we did. And we were able to say something to them in terms of specifically stepping out of the paradigm, stepping out of the process, not participating. And I know I'm putting you on the spot here, Dane. I don't mean to be combative, because that's certainly not where I'm going. I'm really doing a drill down here. I'm really trying, for the audience's benefit, to say, okay, all right, I get it. I got the picture. I see how bad it is. I want to grab a hold of something, by the lapels, and I want to change it. So tell me, you're the expert. Tell me, where do we go? What do we do? How do we grab a hold of this and step out of the participation that we're locked into?
First, I completely welcome your line of questioning, and it's that kind of willingness to face reality that might get something done. What people need to do is, first, abandon the illusion of what they thought would be and embrace what is. That's the first step. If we're living in a world of delusion and not seeing reality clearly, how can we possibly deal with that reality? And that, in the end, involves all of us embracing exactly what is, and letting go of society's programmed notion that our life should be about our personal pursuit of pleasure. I would argue that our good or bad, our good or evil, if you will, exists in the correct use of our own will, each of us. And how many of us are trying to exercise that will correctly, not in the pursuit of more material gain or the next vacation, but rather to remember that we're a part of a whole. And if we don't play our part correctly, the whole collapses, and the whole is collapsing right now. And if a significant percentage of the population actually decided to ask themselves why they're here, what's it all about, and to behave accordingly, and to remember that they have an obligation, especially if they have children. If you have children, you don't own your life anymore, Anthony and Kev. You owe it. You owe it back to the whole. You owe it to those beings that you brought into this world. We have a responsibility to try to correct the course of the Titanic that we're all on right now. And that can be done. It's not that they have to go grab a sign and stand in the street and quit their job. It means that you focus the time, the energy, the resources that you can spare to trying to deal with the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat. And right now, mathematically speaking, short of nuclear cataclysm, climate engineering is the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat, the most dire and immediate threat we face. So if everybody, we have on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org, we have multiple links that tell you exactly what you can do and how, and what's most effective and what's not effective, so that everyone can garner the basic tools and methods they need to help wake those up around them and pass those tools and methods on to those people so that they can do the same. And we can have this issue to light in very short order. And if we can do that, guys, I would argue there will be a shockwave around the globe immediately. I'm not saying our troubles are over, but we would at least have altered the paradigm in a positive direction.
You have spoken in the past about this endless loop, that the compensatory process, the spraying continues because they think that they're going to modify and temper the damage, but the spraying continues to exacerbate the very damage that they think that they're correcting or mitigating. How do we break that loop from, let's call it, from looking at it through the eyes of nature, of the Earth's built-in compensatory mechanisms? How do we break the cycle? Is it merely a matter of grounding the aircraft, so to speak, and then we've got 10 years for the Earth to heal itself? What's the dynamic, and what's the timeline that you see based on that dynamic?
If I could back into that, if we stopped all anthropogenic activity tomorrow or today, everything, there's so much momentum behind the destruction that's already occurred that any potential for an equilibrium of the one we knew, the one that allowed civilization to expand, or maybe explode is a better term, would not happen again likely in a time frame less than perhaps 10 to 20 million years. The planet we've known is done. It's gone, short of some sort of outside intervention from a force that we can't verify or confirm. The planet we've known is done. But we would, backing into what you stated earlier, Anthony, to worship technology, the notion that you could continue to do what you've done, and Einstein and others have alluded to this, right? The definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. The human race, in its unimaginable arrogance, has believed that it could somehow improve on nature. And all our intervention has only diminished our chances of survival. Everything we do on the technology end of trying to intervene with nature, I'm talking about biotech, intervening with the climate, burning up 20 million years of hydrocarbon in the geologic blink of an eye of 100 or 200 years. Everything we do along these lines has all but ensured that planetary omnicide is close. So the notion that with climate engineering, again, the epitome of human insanity and arrogance and hubris, the notion that this kind of intervention with systems that are unimaginably complex, the notion it could do anything but harm is a very naive notion. And when we have, imagine this, Anthony and Kevin, if we have all of academia, all of the climate science community unwilling to even tell the truth about what we can see with our own eyes happening above us, how much more of the system that's being intervened with do they not even know about or understand, let alone are willing to talk about? I mean, you can hardly get your arms around the totality of what's unfolding right now. So again, the God of technology must be abandoned. The reverence for nature must be rekindled. And if the human race has any notion of surviving much longer on this planet, its primary purpose would be to plant trees. You spoke of carbon sequestration earlier. Think of the insanity of the science community. Anthony, Kev, did you see the proposal to put 10 million wind-powered water pumps in the Arctic?
Oh, that's news to me, Dane.
I don't know if you saw that, Anthony, either, but
no, I haven't. Is this related to the Gulf Stream?
It's related.
Movement?
It's related to try to keep the Arctic frozen. So let's think of the insanity of this coming from a science team to put 10 million wind-powered water pumps. How much fossil fuel and energy would that take? You can't even begin to comprehend that. And it gets even worse. These water pumps would pump cool water from the seafloor to the surface to try to refreeze the ice. What happens to the methane deposits on the seafloor then? They thaw even faster. More methane migrates through the water column to the surface and then into the air column. The whole scenario is absurd, and this is coming from, quote, scientists. And then we had recently a team of scientists that took them 3 years to come to this conclusion that, yes, the ice in Greenland is melting, running into the sea and raising sea levels. Did it take a team of scientists 3 years to do that?
When you listen to this, it's almost as if, I mean, these guys they're not stupid. They're knowingly doing this, and you have to ask then, I mean, why the big push to destroy the planet at such a rate?
Well, again, each individual cancer cell is concerned about itself, its own job. Each member of these teams is concerned about their own grant, their own contract, and so forth. And getting back to the comparison of the proposal to manufacture 10 million wind-powered water pumps compared to planting a tree. Don't we have trees? Didn't nature make the most incredible carbon sequestration mechanism of all? That it absorbs carbon, provides shade, expels oxygen. Why wouldn't the human race be engaged in planting trees? Instead, they want to propose building 10 million wind-powered water pumps. But the thing we need to face right now is the fact that, for example, in Northern California and many other parts around the world, you can't plant saplings anymore in the winter and have them grow. They will not grow. I know this firsthand. I live in the middle of the wilderness. I've spent a great deal of time in habitat restoration, and I was able at one time, when the trees would grow, I could plant about 300 trees in a day myself. These are with plugs. They're specifically designed for reforestation. They're sprouted and grown for particular regions, so they're genetically adapted. And on a good day, I could plant 395% would live. Now, none would live. None would survive the summer. How are we to reforest anything when our atmosphere is so decimated? And we can talk about this when you guys choose to. The UV levels are so extreme, in some locations comparable to the surface of Mars, and that was confirmed by NASA, not just our NASA engineer, but NASA as a whole. How are we to replant our forests? And if climate engineering is not stopped, if the ozone recovery is not allowed to happen so we can begin to replenish nature, we have no chance.
And even here in Scotland, where if we're lucky we see the sun twice a year, I mean, even this summer, sitting out in the sun for any longer than 10 minutes, you start to feel your skin prickling. Now, I've been told that is the UV content that causes that, but even the comparison between 5 years ago and now, it's off the scale.
Well, this is the non-linear nature of the equation, that once the dominoes begin to fall, and they are falling, that rate of toppling accelerates radically. And if you guys, maybe after the break, we could, if you want me to read a statement from our NASA engineer, I would be glad to do that, because it's not very long and it's very dire. And the bottom line is, on the UV spectrum for your listeners, we have UVA at the top, UVB, UVC, then X-ray. We're told that 95% of incoming UV radiation is UVA. We're told 5% is UVB, no UVC. We're told that stops 100,000 feet up, and certainly no X-ray. And we're now getting very significant levels of UVC on the surface, exponential levels of UVB and UVC. UVC is a DNA-altering spectrum of UV radiation. It's happening right now. We're seeing mutations in the forest. We found toads in our region, a number of them, with legs coming out of their backs. And granted, there's other factors. We have many DNA endocrine disrupting factors in the environment now. We have all the toxic metals raining down on us. We don't know what's in that mix unless we know what to test for. We know some of the primary elements. So we can't certainly say what's causing these mutations, not just on the amphibians, but on various forms of the foliage as well. But we see really significant changes happening right now. I mean, blindingly fast. A total die-off of aquatic and terrestrial insects. We're in free fall right now to a lifeless planet. There's no question about that. That's why back to what do we do? What do we focus on? For those that want to do, I'll finish with this. For those who want to hear just do A, B, and C, and everything will go back to normal. And if that's the only way they'll engage in the fight, they're no help for the fight, because there is no guaranteed happy ending. The only happy ending lies in knowing you did your best to do your best, and that's why you were here.
You know, Tony, this kind of puts a different slant on our friend Dr. Craig Venter when he's talking about splicing DNA with DNA of cockroaches and things so that we're able to take cosmic radiation for the astronauts. You know, it's not just the astronauts that's going to be needing something like that, Tony, if this carries on.
Yeah, it is mind expanding, to use an old phrase, to say that UVC is the DNA alteration level, and that we used to not see readings in the UVC range, but now we are. I understand that biological damage occurs between 3.4 and 6 in the ultraviolet range, and we're seeing now people on YouTube with their own UV meters showing 600, 800, and 900 on their scale, when 3 to 6 is already doing biological damage. And this is primarily where we're seeing not only UV, but we're seeing this in the millimeter range with 5G technology. And that's something we can talk about after the break, is to step into the world of 5G and that discussion. But I just wanted to toss that to you to think about over the break there, Dane. And I also wanted to ask you about our own shields, our magnetosphere and magnetopause. If you can speak to the integrity or lack of integrity to that in terms of the X-rays and gamma rays. You mentioned the X-ray levels, and so that would be something I'd like you to be prepared to talk about after the break. I find this very sobering, and would like for you to talk a little bit more about not only the NASA data that you have on the UV levels, but also let's delve into the data coming out of Antarctica. But you mentioned the ice pack and the refreezing of it. These guys don't even understand the basics of the thermocline of our oceans, and they don't understand that we also have modified, because of the jet stream, the movement of our own Gulf Stream waters moving up to the Arctic, and then modifying our weather patterns because of the ocean temperatures. So yeah, it's all integrated together. But to change the thermocline is literally playing with death.
Well, the thermohaline circulation, which we've all seen or most have seen the Day After Tomorrow movie. You guys have probably seen that. about a thermohaline shutdown. And there's people now who refer to that. Anthony and Kev, you probably heard people try to. We'll talk after. Is that our break sign? We'll talk after break.
No, all right.
That's okay. You're right. Go ahead.
Listen to you, Dane.
Okay.
We've got 2 minutes left. But
okay, I'm sorry. I thought that might be the break signal. So if you've heard people try to claim that there's a coming ice age because the thermohaline will shut down, we've seen, and this is what we've put forward as the data on geoengineeringwatch.org since the inception of the site, that no matter what happens to the thermohaline circulation, that there is so much momentum built into the greenhouse gas buildup, it will completely overwhelm any scenario like that painted in the Day After Tomorrow movie. In fact, that was what happened in the Younger Dryas. We had an ice dam break over the North American continent, flooded the North Atlantic with fresh water, and that's what shut down the thermohaline. But now, even though the thermohaline is slowing down dramatically, it's not slowing down the warming. We just had the warmest July on record. Did you guys know that? Just had that. Breaking last year's warmest July on record. Did you know that?
Yeah, it seems to be every year we're setting new records now, isn't it?
Exactly. And what has the science community most panicked about this July is there's no El Nino. And we're still shattering records. And we're in a runaway climate shift right now, again, being made worse by climate engineering, not better. So when it comes to the alteration of wind currents, which is altering ocean currents, which is pushing warm water into the Arctic, which is further thawing methane, pumping more methane into the atmosphere as it migrates through the water column, all of these feedback loops, as Anthony mentioned, all of these are coming into play, and it appears right now there may be as many as 50 feedback loops. The geoengineering fuels the forest fires, the soot settles down in the ice loses its albedo, its reflectivity, it begins to melt, and so on and so forth.
There we go, Dane. We're almost on the break there, folks. We've still got 1 hour left to go with Dane Wigington from geoengineeringwatch.org. Join us on the other side. Lots more to come.
This is Truth Frequency Radio.
The wicked ones obviously under heavy Masonic influence.
All right. Well, there's our wonderful theme music provided by Cheryl and Robbie Spencer, and we always appreciate their talents and their music. And I want to let you know that they are also responsible for our online magazine, Entangled. And they worked very hard behind the scenes to bring together all the articles from all of our contributors. And last month, they put together a 100-page issue of Entangled magazine that was just overwhelming. It was amazing. Kev Baker himself contributed 12 articles to that. Our guest tonight is Dane Wigington, also a contributor to the Entangled magazine. And just during the break, we were speaking off the air, and I didn't have to twist his arm too much, and I thank you for that, Dane. But he is also going to participate in a conference that is coming up on the 16th and 17th of September, sponsored by Entangled magazine, and that is Full Spectrum Dominance. This will be a live stream event. Dane will be speaking along with a host of other guests that will be contributing to this. You can find all the information out at anthonypatch.com, all of the speakers, the topics. Registration begins on Monday, the eclipse day. And Dane, just be prepared because I'm going to ask you about the eclipse from your perspective. But we really appreciate everyone who has subscribed to Entangled magazine. We hope that lots of people will sign up for the live stream event as well. We're trying to keep the costs down very low just to cover our costs for Robbie's time, because Robbie is also lending his technical expertise to pulling together this live stream event from his studio. So we need to compensate him fairly as a professional. We're only asking for $10 per day. Many people that do live stream conferences charge $80 to $100 for their events. We're just trying to get the information out there and cover our costs at the same time. So again, thank you, Dane, for agreeing to participate in the conference as well as you have been and will be continuing to do with Entangled magazine. Where we'd like to go is to, again, correct some of the terminology, do away with this name of chemtrail, and bring in the proper terminology, nomenclature, if you will. And then we're going to talk about UV levels and data in Antarctica and the sea rise a little bit more, and we'll continue on from there to talk about the eclipse. Take it away, my friend.
Well, on the correct terms, as we discussed off the air, for what do we call what we see in the sky, and unfortunately, there's not a term that is as simplistic as the chemtrail term. But again, given the detriment that term is to the cause, a more accurate description would be a geoengineering, particulate trail, solar radiation management, dispersion, climate engineering, dispersion. These are aircraft spraying, and when we relate to the issue as a whole, if we use basic terms like climate engineering, that's a very, very straightforward term. In fact, I'm not sure, Kev and Anthony, if you've seen any of our billboards, but we've done a number of large billboards on major thoroughfares in California, thoroughfares that are 6 lanes in both directions, big digital billboards. And we use the climate engineering term because it's very straightforward. People understand what that must mean. And so if we stick to straightforward terms like that, and then for those that are a little more educated, we can use solar radiation management, explain what that is. It's somewhat self-explanatory. But if we relate what we see in the sky, these aircraft dispersions, to those issues, that would be a much more correct definition. And if we fall back on the term that causes people to go home and Google and find conspiracy theory and hoax, that's not helping us. And even if those people realize that there's something to this issue, if they feel they're going to be marginalized by addressing this issue because there's so much, quote, conspiracy theory and hoax, they're less likely to pick up the torch and help carry it. Whereas if they realize there's science, and if people go home and search solar radiation management, geoengineering, stratospheric aerosol injection, they find mountains of science from every science institution on the planet, they're going to feel more confident about sharing this, and that's what we need them to do.
Let me throw a curveball at you, my friend, and then we'll get into the UV levels and get into talking about more of the sea level rise that really I don't think is discussed enough in terms of the issue of the melting methane, because you rarely hear anybody talking about the methane that's being released. And if people will picture the scenario in the Bermuda Triangle of ships disappearing, many of those instances have been attributed to the massive, sudden, spontaneous release of methane from the seafloor, resulting in a loss of buoyancy at the surface, thus sinking ships with no distress calls. So that kind of thing taking place, but in other examples. Where I'm going with this, Dane, is what about organizations that claim to be all about saving the planet, like Greenpeace? How do these organizations fit in to your dialogue and your efforts?
They're completely hypocritical. There's no question about that. And I did a national radio show with Greenpeace's top scientists some time back, and that show is online. It was done by Go Green Radio. And if anyone listens to that exchange, it would be clear to them that he absolutely knew this was going on. He all but admitted to it, but wouldn't admit to it. But how does that hypocrisy help us? It doesn't. And for whatever Greenpeace does to protect the environment, if they gather these legions of followers who now won't face the climate engineering issue because their organization refuses to acknowledge it, how does that help the whole? If the climate engineering issue is the single greatest assault by the human race ever launched against the web of life, and we have these organizations unwilling to face it, are they not doing a bigger disservice than any service they do? And I would argue the answer is yes. And if we have Anthony and Kev, do you know who Amy Goodman is?
No, I don't.
No.
Okay, Democracy Now! Is the largest syndicated independent news program on the planet. And that's Amy Goodman's show. And I've met with her twice. I once supported her show, but just like Greenpeace, Amy Goodman is telling half the truth. Although she addresses a lot of important issues, she will not speak about 9/11, and she will not speak about climate engineering, and she's getting funding from the Ford Foundation. So here we have a massive independent news organization that's telling a half-truth. And an example I feel is important to use with this subject matter, if you have a boat that only holds half the water out, how long will it float? It won't. Yep. And so we have to tell the whole truth. Same is true with all the environmental organizations, guys, from Sierra Club, WWF, NRDC, all of them. And our attorneys at geoengineeringwatch.org, the geoengineeringwatch.org legal team, who are struggling because, by the way, we're we are not getting FOIAs back. FOIAs that our government agencies are legally required to give us, they are not giving us. And this is the sort of animal we're up against. But our team has talked to the attorneys from these various organizations. None of them are willing to help in this battle against climate engineering because they fear they could lose their 501s. How much will that help them if the ship goes down, guys? How much?
I'm going to take another direction. I apologize up front.
No worries.
It's almost like playing racquetball sometimes when guys
Sure.
come on my show. I'm a Christian. I have been saved by the blood of Jesus Christ, not because I'm special, but because I gave up my life to him. That's the short story. So I'm going to ask you, related to that, these organizations that claim to be of the Greenpeace ilk, news organizations, universities, and even, dare I say, politicians who claim to be concerned about the climate issues. Do you see a spiritual component to what's going on? Let me put it in a very common phrase, evil. Do you see an evil spiritual component to what is going on with killing the planet and killing the human race?
I think it would be hard not to use that term, wouldn't it? I mean, we really, so much we see happening with everything we've discussed. I think that term applies, and I would not argue that term at all. And this being said, the motive that drives men to do what they do throughout history, and more so now than ever, that term would certainly apply. And I think if we try to find the common ground with all major spiritual traditions, then all of them, and you can correct me if you think I'm off base here, Anthony, but all of them that I know of, and I've studied all the major spiritual traditions, we're all required to be good stewards of the planet, along with a long list of other moral imperatives. How many do you see adhering to that? And even in the Christian church, and I'm not faulting Christianity at all, and there are profound truths that we cannot argue there, but I have been in every major spiritual congregation in Northern California, and there are many, and they are big, and I've met with their leaders. And without exception, everyone initially handed me back our data, which is non-political, and said, we don't need to worry about this, it's all in bigger hands. To which I would respond, because I know Scripture well. Not as well as you, I'm sure, but I know it well enough to know that we are not allowed to sit and do nothing. The parable of the talents would forbid that, along with many other biblical text passages. And I was able to shame all of them into taking our data, but I know it went nowhere after that. And I would argue that such men as these pastors and these congregations, and again, this is no reflection on Christianity at all, but simply those that are claiming to be the leaders of these congregations, I would hope they are held most responsible for not only not facing these issues themselves, but ensuring that their congregation would also do nothing. And the parable of the talents would expressly forbid doing nothing, would it not?
Agreed with you. We're looking at another organized group that fails to uphold the tenets of Scripture, the basic foundations of being good stewards of the planet. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. When you get into organized religion, and it doesn't matter what religion it is, they become beholden to their governments because of regulations. And in this country, the 501c3, as you mentioned, their tax status, and therefore they're subject to being manipulated and used, just like the universities have been compromised. I don't see any difference between organized religions today and what has happened in the compromising of our university systems. And I agree with you. I think it's a lost cause to look to those leaders, and they are held to a much higher standard of judgment, let's say, consequences for being failed leaders. And I'm speaking of God himself holding those people responsible. But it comes down to each of us individually, and I'm going to let you have the floor again, but it comes down to us individually and our individual relationship with our Savior, in my perspective as a Christian, with Jesus Christ. And there are other religions that also hold to accountability and consequences for one's actions. I believe in the one and true God from my Christian perspective, but I'm not shutting other people down and saying that. I'm saying that we all have, as occupants of this planet, the responsibility, a responsibility given to us by our Creator to be good stewards. Take it away, my friend.
Well, in regard to other leaders of other congregations here in Northern California, from the Buddhists, Mormons, Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholics, I've met with them all. And the response was the same. And with all these spiritual traditions, the same responsibility to be good stewards of our planet is there. It's simply not being followed. And the leaders of these congregations are, in the interest of, or with whatever agenda they have, not trying to call their congregations to action just to keep the, quote, business as usual. That's back to what we discussed earlier in the show. That's why we're in the mess we're in. That's why we have so many people, whether actively or passively, playing their part in the proliferation of the cancer. And that's exactly what's happening. We discussed off the air something that I would like to go into in great depth, because this is a huge aspect of the state of the climate and climate engineering.
Yeah, absolutely. We have about 10 minutes.
Okay. It's chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. This is outlined in the 20-page booklet I mentioned to you earlier that we've now put together and made available on Geoengineering Watch. It's something I write about, post articles about often, because it's imperative that a larger percentage of the population understands that this is a massive part of the geoengineering effort. Chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. So if people would investigate this, understand there's patents, understand the Chinese government openly announced they were doing it, Popular Science, Fox News all covered it, that they can, with chemical ice nucleation materials, convert what should have been a rainstorm into a snowstorm and lower the surface temperatures on the ground to very extreme departures from what they were for a specified amount of time, depending on the moisture they have, depending on the jet stream manipulation. So when we see these quote-unquote freak snowstorms, like over pyramids, over the United Arab Emirates and other places where big headlines come up, it's never snowed in 2,000 years of history and blah, blah, blah. Nobody mentions, oh, by the way, it was 45 degrees or 50 degrees. Why don't they mention that? Because they don't want people to know. They want people to think this is somehow natural, thus fueling the confusion and the division in regard to the true state of the climate. So the two mantras, again, that I would argue that we must adopt to try to unite the tribes, and we need to unite the tribes or we're not going to get anywhere in this battle. No legitimate discussion about climate engineering without including climate engineering first, and no legitimate discussion about climate engineering without including chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. So if you guys have seen some of these events where we have from record highs to record cold in a day, perhaps?
Oh, yeah, definitely we have. Kev, you can speak to Scotland. I mean, yours has been precipitous up and down the thermometer, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, this summer in particular as well, but we have a kind of joke over here that we can see 4 seasons in one day, Dane, over in Scotland, because the weather just swings from one end to the other. And in Europe this summer, it's been absolutely insane, to the point where they actually nicknamed the heat wave that's going on Heat Wave Lucifer. The weather's just totally off kilter.
Yeah, I saw that, and this is what the population needs to evaluate and understand is the heat is building up all over the globe, and the oceans are the greatest reflection of that. We have sea temperatures in some Arctic zones that have been as much as 27 degrees above normal. And the amount of thermal energy it takes to do that is immense. It's much greater than the air temperatures. Cubic meter of ocean water, again, contains 4,000 times the thermal energy of a cubic meter of air. So the geoengineers can cool down a shallow layer of air, lower the temperatures, confuse and divide the population, while they at the same time are fueling the overall thermal energy buildup on the planet. So some of the extreme examples, I'm not sure if we've talked about this before, Anthony and Kev, but did you guys ever see or hear about, or have we talked about the 100,000 cattle that were killed in 2013 in South Dakota by a snowstorm?
I can't remember you bringing that one up, Dane. Not on the last show we were on.
Okay. So that's an important example of chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. I did a very big post on that event, and I captured all the maps before they were erased offline, and they were. So October 4th, 2013, in South Dakota, at temperatures of about 40 degrees, a snowstorm occurred. At the very same time that that snowstorm was occurring there, a stone throw away in Chicago, it was 85 degrees and raining. Further south in Kansas City, it was 89 degrees and raining. How could 100,000 cold, hardy cattle die in a 40-degree snowstorm? And why is it snowing at 40 degrees? The chemically nucleated material that comes from this is very heavy, very adhesive, sticks to the cow's hides, clogs around their noses, and if their nose is clogged, they die. They won't breathe through their mouth. And it also is extremely cold to the touch because it's an endothermic reacting material, so it flash burns them as well. So 4 days after this event, we have 100,000 cattle laying around in the mud, dead. And why would these ranchers not realize something's wrong? And I tried to contact them. I contacted the Dakota Ranchers Association. And when I mentioned weather modification, which, guys, you know, I mean, how many people do we know that haven't heard of weather modification? Isn't that a generally accepted practice?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So I mentioned weather modification, couldn't get any facts out of my mouth, and the representatives at the Dakota Ranching Department, you know, behaved as if I just said the aliens were invading, and you know, not that that's another subject for other shows, I guess, for other people, but I'm not faulting any area of discussion, but I'm saying that for them to behave that way when I mentioned weather modification was absurd, absolutely absurd. They didn't want to hear anything else. So we have, again, another sign of the population, even though great damage is being inflicted on them, choosing to ram their heads into the sand instead of facing the issue. And the same year, May 1st, 2013, in Amarillo, Texas, was 100 degrees on the ground, all-time record high, snowed the next day. How can you possibly go from 100 degrees to snow in a day? Chemical ice nucleation for weather modification.
So let me ask you a quick question about the ranchers. Do you think, or do you have information that they were financially compensated by the government for their losses?
Although I'm sure they were, I don't think that was a factor or known by the person I talked to. It's just simply societal programming. That so many people in so many places are so well trained to never question their government. And this sort of Stockholm syndrome, if you will. Isn't that what it is? It's exactly what it is. You know,
definitely is.
We have that going on across the board. We had a similar circumstance in Texas in, I believe, 2015. We had 30,000 cattle die, same thing, record high to snowstorm that killed 30,000 cattle. We had 250,000 llamas die in South America twice, 250,000 from chemically nucleated events. So,
well, let me ask you this then. Because we always drill down and define, and I'm always thinking about the new listeners we have to the show. We have 4 minutes to go. Would you please describe this nucleation? Describe it physically, to paint a picture of what the nucleation actually looks like. You just mentioned that it sticks and it's sticky. It is sticky. It sticks to the noses, to the nostrils of the cattle, and that it is exothermic in that it's giving off heat and causing burns to occur. But what does it look like? What is it made of?
Actually, it's endothermic. It's an energy absorbing reaction, but it does flash burn. It does flash burn. So for your listeners, they know what an exothermic reaction is, an explosion of energy. Endothermic reaction, absorption, I know you know, but for your listeners, and that rapid absorption and that intense cold causes the flash burn. We see it on foliage here constantly when they're nucleating. It flash burns the foliage as well. So this reaction creates snow in the sense that people would understand this. You have big flakes falling from the sky, but they're very different. Big cotton candy looking flakes, very different from a naturally nucleated storm. And because those crystals tend to grow on themselves. It creates a much larger and more unnatural looking flake. And it can also nucleate even on sea surfaces. I think we might have discussed this before, guys, the 75-pound ice balls occurring repeatedly in Lake Michigan. You guys have seen that probably.
Yes, we have.
Same thing. Why doesn't anybody ask the obvious question? How can you have a 75-pound spherical ice ball, and lots of them, in fact, on water temperatures of 40 degrees and higher? How is that possible? And if they search the subject, and for your listeners, anything they want to search at geoengineeringwatch.org, if they go to a search engine and they search geoengineeringwatch.org ozone damage, or geoengineeringwatch.org chemical ice nucleation, or geoengineeringwatch.org engineered snowstorms, etc., they're going to find data. So they can search easily in that regard. So if they want to see an actual lab test of biological ice nucleating agents and chemical, they can see very short 15, 30-second lab tests on some of our articles showing a vessel of water with these chemical nucleating agents added. It freezes instantly in front of their face. That's how powerful these elements are, and they're being used on a scale that defies comprehension. So in the cold air is dense, and it causes it to it descends. And if you're outside during one of these events, and I have been, all you can hear is aircraft going over, and it feels like someone opened the refrigerator door. This cold blast comes down from the clouds. Thermometer might drop 15 or 20 degrees in a very short time. But again, it's a cold, dense layer on the ground. And what are we seeing at altitude at the same time? I'm communicating with private pilots and some commercial pilots, and they are seeing nothing but positive atmospheric temperature anomalies above average across the board. Huge departures from normal, all higher than normal. So there's no question what I described is exactly what's going on. And the eastern half of the country that's been in an engineered cool down for quite some time. And that's only, statistically, that's less than 1% of the world's surface area, the Earth's surface area. So for those people in the eastern half of the U.S. who think that it must be the same around the rest of the world, I just challenge them to consider that's a very small part of the world. The rest of the world is very different. They're frying. They're cooking, literally, without exception.
Do you see on the East Coast a colder than normal winter coming up and an earlier onset of winter?
I don't. I think they're going to have a very hard time. They're losing ground by the day. The planet's warming by the day at an exponential rate. In fact, in Australia right now, we have heat wave in Australia. Parts of Australia, it's winter there. You guys know that. And the temperatures there in parts of Australia are pushing 100 degrees. The only cool area is around the most populated zones. That's where they focus, to cool down the areas where the most people are, to create the most confusion amongst the biggest percentage of population. It's going to be hard to keep things cool much longer.
All right, we're going to break.
You're listening to the Truth Frequency Radio Network.
No hate, no hype, no fear.
Welcome back, everyone. It's the final part of tonight's broadcast of the Anthony Patch Show. And of course, you're tuned in live to tfrlive.com. That's right, you're at the home of Truth Frequency Radio. I'm Kev Baker. You're tuned in to Anthony Patch, who's here as well. And of course, Dane Wigington from Geoengineeringwatch.org. Been an amazing show so far. And before we jump right back into this with one of my favourite topics, NASA, no less, tongue-in-cheek, I say that. Let me just remind everyone, don't go anywhere after this show finishes, because Freaky Friday will be on after the break. I'll be going on there with the rest of the Woo crew. And then immediately after that, we've got Chris and Sheree Geo, Beyond the Veil, followed by Brent Thomas and the Paranormal Portal. So there's no reason to go anywhere else tonight. And of course, Anthony will be back with me, same time, same place, Monday, Wednesday. We'll be back on Friday next week as well. But Dane, earlier on during one of the breaks, you mentioned the fact that a NASA scientist had put out a bit of a dire warning. And I'd love to start that segment here, because I want to really hit the listeners hard with this one, brother.
We have a 40-year avionics engineer for NASA, 40-year veteran that's working directly with geoengineeringwatch.org. He has equipment that we've supplied him, state-of-the-art equipment. He's taking readings because there are no official sources for these readings. They are not measuring UV officially below 300 nanometers, and that's where the very lethal bands begin. And you can't find what you're not looking for, and we certainly know publicly they're not disclosing it. So if I could, this is a very short statement from the NASA engineer, was made last week in an article. It's posted at geoengineeringwatch.org under the top stories in recent sections. This is what he said. Events in the upper ozone layer have changed again for the worse. My research on the ozone layer, and this person's remaining anonymous right now, by the way, for obvious reasons. My research on the ozone layer and UVC solar radiation has been extremely difficult due to the lack of public information and cooperation from the science community. This has changed recently with current administration, i.e. the Trump administration, completely denying climate change. They cut funds to several agencies, resulting in massive layoff in the science sector. Some of those scientists and engineers are now coming forward with information on our atmosphere and upper ozone layer. Collecting this data is tenuous, as most researchers and scientists have signed a non-disclosure agreement and could suffer massive fines and or jail time if their research data were ever to come into the public view. Anonymity and caution are key words here, as I already stated. However, there is an answer to our upper atmospheric issues once the basics are understood. For example, our upper ozone layer is collapsing now. Why? The answer is simple. Due to increased geoengineering efforts and the previously existing fossil fuel pollutants in our atmosphere, there is less oxygen reaching the top of the atmosphere, TOA. The oxygen molecules created from our oceans are being destroyed by massive particulate matter being dispersed by jet aircraft and other pollutants. Before it can reach the tropopause, an estimate of oxygen reaching the tropopause is between 20 to 26% of what is normal. In other words, down 75%. Almost done. Why is oxygen important? Oxygen, when irradiated by solar UVC, creates ozone. Then it performs another critical function. It forms a barrier to harmful UVC radiation. It forms a shield for all life on Earth to the very worst wavelength of UVC at 270 nanometers. So what do? It's imperative that we put oxygen back in the top of the atmosphere and stop geoengineering altogether, all of it. The SAI, stratospheric aerosol injection programs of the military, and SRM programs from scientists, solar radiation management. Time is critical. Many hundreds of thousands of plants, animals are already gone forever. Do we only, quote, get the big picture when it's our turn? That's it. That's a dire statement from a 40-year aeronautics aviation engineer from NASA, and he has given us, Kev and Anthony, approximately, mathematically, on the current trajectory, 8 years until total ozone layer collapse. Game over if we stay on this trajectory.
Wow.
So factoring in 8 years, and then Kev, I'm kind of talking to you. You and I have shared all these scenarios about DNA modification, quantum computers, and the sentient world simulation, and the bigger issue of artificial intelligence being, according to Elon Musk and people like him that are in his particular slice of AI, saying it's the greatest existential threat to mankind is AI, and that's emanating out of the world of quantum computing. And then we factor in, the games at CERN. Well, it looks to me, Kev, like we're throwing a bigger blanket over all of those issues when we are talking about the danger to the biosphere and the implosion of it. What do you think about that statement coming from little old me?
It's definitely, it puts things in perspective, and this kind of trumps everything else if we're on that kind of timetable.
Yeah, if we're only looking at 8 years, then these guys, they're talking 20 years for this, that, and the other thing. Their timetables in other disciplines of science that we cover, 8 years is nothing. They will not be able to implement. And Dane, you go ahead and jump in here on that.
What I was going to add is, again, let's keep in mind that if we stay on this trajectory, and if there's no additional feedback loops to speed this time scale up even further, it's not like things stay as they are for the next 8 years. Not at all. I would argue we are perilously close to links in the chain of the reality we've all known falling out, because the ozone, the UV radiation, the ozone destruction and UV radiation is so extreme already, right now, today, that we have massive biosphere collapse happening everywhere. We've already lost one of the 7 great wonders of the world, the Great Barrier Reef, largest living organism on the planet. It's done for all practical purposes. An even larger habitat, the kelp forests around Australia, done. Along the California coast, completely imploded. I just came back from my meetings on the coast and examined everywhere I could find, looking for a sea star, a starfish. None. There's none. The beach was littered with dead birds. We have sea fisheries collapsing right now. So we shouldn't think along the lines of, well, we have 8 more years to try to figure out what's going on. Our situation, if we stay on this trajectory, will collapse far, far sooner. In fact, I think it would be prudent for us all to keep our eyes on the horizon, because all the conditions are there right now. So many factors are so far past the breaking point that giant links in the chain could fall out at any time. And thus the geopolitical maneuvering, which is all connected to biosphere collapse ultimately, the push toward global conflict, because that's the only card the military-industrial complex has left to play.
That is very true. I mean, let me go back to my perspective from a biblical standpoint. We've all heard of the 7-year tribulation. There has been discussion that I have somewhat echoed that September 23rd, due to Revelation 12, and we're seeing what I estimate to be, surmise to be, the birthing of the spirit of the Antichrist. It's conjecture, pure conjecture, but perhaps on a spiritual level, we're looking at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation on a spiritual side, maybe not in a physical manifestation, but possibly this is an indication of either the start or the nearness of that 7-year. So if we look at 7 years from a biblical perspective and then take this 8-year time frame, we're looking at all hell breaking loose for the next 7 years. And I agree, 8 years is not the end point. It's what happens between now and that end point that is going to be catastrophic in and of itself. So it can be from a biblical standpoint or a secular scientific standpoint. We've got a real problem, folks. Go ahead.
We do, and I would, however bleak the horizon looks, I would always argue this, that we've never had any guarantee. At no point in human history is there a guarantee of outcomes, if you will. And what's in our hands, what's been given to us to exercise correctly, morally, honorably, is our will. And again, however long the odds look against us, we're responsible to stay at our post and exercise that will until we take our last breath. And that's the change in perspective that needs to happen, as we discussed earlier in this show, for the population to accept that, not only accept it, but embrace it. Because we will have to accept what comes, and we can accept it well or we can accept it poorly, but we'll accept it one way or the other. Why not make the most of why you're here? We're not here without reason. You guys would agree with that, right? There's a reason why we're here, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And it's up to us to do our best with the part we've been given in the play by our Maker. And all of us, if we had that perspective and we woke up every morning with the mission of what can I do today? What stone can I roll down the hill that might trigger an avalanche? Who haven't I talked to? Who haven't I told this to? Who haven't I shared with? That we have a responsibility to try to sound the alarm, if you will, and we need to live up to that.
Let me take a different stab at it. We're hitting the racquetball to a different corner of the court here, and that is Fukushima. Why is it that Fukushima has not been mitigated? Why is it from the beginning there really wasn't any overt attempt to, capture the cores before they began their meltdown?
I think data indicates they had no way of stopping what happened. And before he died, I had fairly regular communication with General Burt Stubblebine, and he's a retired Army Major General. He spoke out about 9/11. And what General Stubblebine told me was that the tsunami that hit Japan, and the quake was an intended effort on the part of the U.S. Now, I can't substantiate that. I'll give a few corroborating factors in a moment. But what he said, his Pentagon contacts said, was that Fukushima was an unintended consequence. If you trigger a 9.0 earthquake, bad things happen. We also have the Stuxnet virus, U.S. and Israel, that was released that it appears kept the Fukushima safety mechanisms from working. Was that intended or unintended? We can't tell. In regard to the ionosphere heaters on the planet, I know we didn't go into this, I don't think, before, but regarding to their potential to create seismic activity, in addition to a potential seafloor nuke, we have MIT. If you guys haven't seen this, I would recommend looking it up. You can search MIT Fukushima atmospheric heating. And you'll find MIT stating on the record that in the days prior to the quake, the atmosphere directly above the epicenter heated extremely anomalously to extreme temperatures. It's exactly what we would expect if ionosphere heater transmissions, microwave transmissions, were combined, bounced off the atmosphere, and back down into Earth strata in a seismically sensitive zone. What happens, guys, when you put something with a lot of moisture in the microwave and turn it on for too long? It explodes, correct?
Yep, correct.
Same thing happens in the seafloor. You beam that signal into a seismically sensitive zone, and this is not disputed scientifically. You can create seismic activity. Now, why would they do that to Japan? Japan was allying with its regional partners prior to that event. After that event, they were in complete lockstep with whatever the U.S. wanted. So this is the kind of actions that it appears the U.S. military may be involved with. And let's add one more corroborating factor. Ken Caldera he's a former government scientist. You can hear him say this on the record, by the way, if you search geoengineeringwatch.org, Ken Caldera. Your listeners can hear an audio of this former government scientist, world's second most recognized geoengineer, stating on the record his job for the government was to try to find ways to create natural disasters like tsunamis. He specifically says that. And he goes on to say this, and to find ways of seeding the clouds with pathogens to infect the populations below. That was his job for the government. You can hear him say it in his own words. So as hard to get your arms around as some of these possibilities may be, if we look at the facts, becomes not only plausible, but probable. So back to Fukushima and not being able to stop it. How many Pandora's boxes has the power structure opened with no idea how to stop it? There's no technology to fix Fukushima, 3 triple meltdowns. In fact, we have a recent headline from Fukushima that mentions the brain tumors that are resulting and the attempts of the government. This is about a 2-day-old headline. It's trying to find, here it is, hospital, Fukushima radiation may be eating holes in people's brains. Report, military brought in to hide the true radiation levels. This is a new report. Officials covering up dire consequences of crisis, worry over high number of cancers being detected, public suffering radioactive related diseases. What a surprise. And we're building 60 more of those plants right now. There's no sanity in this equation. And those in power have no understanding or regard for the consequences of their actions. And we're all about to reap the repercussions of that.
It is sobering, my friend. We have about 12 minutes to go. I'm going to put a plug in for one of my books. I published Covert Catastrophe in 2013. The book opens with what you just described of HAARP inducing the earthquake and tsunami, exactly as you're talking about in my book. That was based upon hard research. This is nothing more than Tesla technology being used. But again, it's like, okay, so we've polluted the entire Pacific. We have now seafood that no one should be eating. And it isn't interesting. You don't see an impact upon the fishing community. The trawlers are still going out. They're still catching fish. They're still bringing them back to the stores. People are still eating the fish. And, having been for 20 years on the Oregon coast and seeing the dying off of the starfish, as you described, to now to the point where they're extinct, and nobody's saying anything about it. Even in the fishing community, they're still catching fish that we know are polluted, are affected by Fukushima, and yet people will still eat the fish. It boggles the mind why people are not standing up against this.
It is truly shocking. Thank you for sharing that on your book. And we're on exactly the same page, and there is hard data to back it up. With you on that completely. And although they're catching fish, they're not catching many in places, and the salmon fisheries are completely shut down on the West Coast right now. And in fact, here's a recent statistic on bluefin tuna, once a staple fish for global populations. 3% of the original population is thought to be left, or less. 3%. Almost done. Gone. How long can we last? And we have, again, other fisheries. We had 50,000 tons of salmon just go belly up earlier this year in Chile. 50,000 tons just went belly up in fish farms in, I believe, Vietnam. So even the fish farms are tanking now. This paradigm is unraveling by the day, and it's being hidden from the U.S. population. We have literally by the most recent statistics, about $20 billion worth of food being imported from countries that are starving to death into this country to pacify the American population until the last possible moment. That's what's going on.
You mentioned the UV. We see indications on the East Coast that the leaves on the trees are curling up, turning brown. We're not talking about the normal fall colors. We're only in August here. The UV, you can't plant. As you said, you cannot plant your plugs for reforestation. You cannot grow crops anymore. I mean, what's the alternative? If you can't plant food, then you're killing off the population through starvation. I mean, where do we go?
The problem is, in this course, if we are fully immersed in a runaway event and we continue in this direction, there's no stopping it. This planet will turn into something that more resembles Venus in the geologic blink of an eye. That's a mathematical fact. The latest statistics indicate we may be looking at a 10 degrees C rise in the next 9 years, 10 degrees C. It appears from available data right now that we are past the baseline temperature at which humans have existed on this planet. That's mind-numbing. That we may be, although the ice is not melted yet because it takes time for 3 miles of ice to melt in some locations, but it appears because there's such a falsification of data to the downside, not the upside. Everywhere we check, we see a radical falsification of high temperatures to the downside, which means we are likely past 3.5 degrees C right now. That's the baseline at which humans have been on this planet. How long will we be here? Photosynthesis stops at 104 degrees, tapers off when it nears that point, stops, completely done. We are very close to the point where we will not be able to grow or sustain anything here. And it is so nonlinear. In the leaves that you mentioned, Anthony, we're seeing the same thing here. Total, in some cases, total defoliation of the trees. Right now, they started dropping leaves in June because the leaves are literally frying on the trees and falling off. And that is not the abscission hormone. Leaves used to fall, guys. Remember, they would fall still intact, discolored, but intact. And they wouldn't dry up until they'd been on the ground for a while. Now they're totally dried on the tree. And one more point, what they're doing, it appears to create the illusion of a change of season the last 6 years in Northern California. Particular rain comes in the fall, and all the leaves on most of the deciduous trees flash out dead and hang on the trees. And that is absolutely not a natural occurrence. And the only thing that can do that is a defoliant in that mix. They defoliated jungles in Vietnam in the 70s. They can sure do it here now on a smaller scale. And it appears they're doing that to create the illusion of a change of season. So we have trees that are not subjected to wind in Redding, fully foliated with stone-dead leaves all winter long. Common now here.
Jeez. What do you see in the San Joaquin Valley there in California, the breadbasket? What do you see in terms of crop yields occurring there this year?
It's a disaster. If you drive down I-5, and I did not long ago, I had a speaking presentation further south, and they're trying to cover up some of the orchards. In fact, I saw miles and miles and miles of citrus, which is sun hardy, completely covered with shade cloth to try to keep it from frying. Other orchards are being torn out. Other orchards are being sprayed with UV protectant chemicals. This is a completely futile attempt to deal with what's going on. Also, most don't know this, you have massive subsidence occurring in the Sacramento Valley. The ground is sinking because it's drying out and they're pumping water out. What's that do for the California aqueduct that's at such a carefully delicate balance of downflow to Southern California? It's not going to work much longer. And we just have from every direction, guys, cataclysm unfolding. But they're tearing orchards out with excavators that are fried to a crisp already.
Yeah, we're looking at starvation, folks. We have 5 minutes to go. I want you to speak to whatever you like, but if you've got upcoming appearances, if you have a book, if you have publications, more information you want to get out in terms of links and sources, go right ahead, my friend.
Thank you, Anthony. I have one goal. I live for the day when we can fully expose this issue, because I believe at that point the paradigm shift will occur, shockwave around the globe. We've historically given out materials at geoengineeringwatch.org to the best degree we could with the limited resources we've had. We've given out 500,000 flyers, 10,000 commercial DVDs. We're at the point now where to get them to the general public, which is essential, we're simply trying to make those materials available for the approximate cost of printing, packaging, shipping them. and we print in massive quantities. So, for example, the 20-page booklet, which I sent to you guys, it's like a small book. We're offering 20 of those books and a commercial DVD, bumper sticker, flyers, other things, with shipping, with tax, with everything for $30. It's just barely enough to cover our costs. We're trying to offer materials for this reason, and people can download them and print them themselves for free. If you want to do that, just as good, because all I care about is getting materials into circulation. But if you have powerful tools like this, encourage people to read that booklet and see it's very hard-hitting data, impossible to ignore. If we can get these tools into circulation, share credible data, or share a link to credible data online, and you don't need to purchase anything at that point. You just need to share that link with people, and don't go into a big tirade with them. Just simply say, hey, this is dire and extremely urgent. We need to focus on this. You can share a link to the whole booklet with people as well online. So whatever means you use, I appeal, I plead, I beg for people to help us get this issue to the light of day. And if we can, populations around the globe would realize what their governments have done to them without their knowledge, without their consent. And I would argue, again, paradigm shift at that moment. And we need to reach that moment quickly. So I just appeal to your listeners to please effectively, efficiently help us to credibly sound the alarm.
I commend you for your dedication. I've listened to you for over 10 years now, and it is always the same message consistently. You have put the word out there. There are many, many millions of people that I think have heard the message but are discounting it. And I encourage people that are listening to this show to become an activist, just like Dane, and get the information out there. As you say, just give them the link. That's all they need to do. They can read for themselves. I commend you, my friend. You are a moral and right individual, and you've certainly been in the front of this battle for a long time, and I know that it is that great personal sacrifice to you and your family, and I thank you for what you've done. Folks, support Dane's efforts, the people that are working with him. I'll just be blunt about it. Put your money where your mouth and where your heart are. He's not doing this for money. Support his organization. Support those, especially his legal team that's behind him, trying to fight the fight in the courts, which is a tough one and an expensive one. But go ahead. You got a couple of moments.
The legal team is working pro bono, just so your listeners know right now. They know that they're going down with the ship as well. So right now, our greatest focus is to simply reach a critical mass of awareness, which people can do without any expenditure by sharing that link, or if they want to physically share, like those booklets and so forth, those are all available on the homepage. Again, we're offering them for about our cost of processing and printing. If they can just help us to sound the alarm, that's our most critical part, because as we do that, Anthony, we'll have legions of attorneys willing to help us then pro bono at that point. So we're back to the most critical effort to sound the alarm, period, with credible, verifiable data. That's what we're trying to put out. And hey, guys, by the way, it's a team effort. The same gratitude to you two who have also relentlessly been in the battle. Without people like you, we wouldn't have a voice. It's a team effort, all of us working together, that matters. So my gratitude back to both of you.
Thank you, my friend. Kev, take us out.
You know, for people out there, this is one of the easiest, although it may be dire, but the easiest of topics to bring new people to the information, because we can all just tell them to look up. We can see the aerosol spraying above our heads. And then what you can do is you can direct them to Dane's site over at geoengineeringwatch.org, where they'll get an education then, and they'll see it's not some conspiracy theory. Absolutely brilliant show tonight. Share it far and wide, folks, because this is one of these topics that it affects us all. And don't forget, I will be swapping hats and becoming one of the Woo crew after the break. We are going to be talking about the darkening skies, Eclipse Woo, and so much more on Freaky Friday. Then Chris and Cherie, and also after that, Brent Thomas, Paranormal Portal. So for another week, and don't worry, we'll be back soon. This is the Anthony Pat Show, signing out. Thanks for listening.
Not even discussing that, and they don't include, Anthony or Kev, any climate feedback loops in any of their modeling. How can that be? How can they call themselves science? There's no question the climate science community is betraying the human race with such omissions. But in regard to the fact that there are serious ramifications from the excess greenhouse gas buildup. And there's a number of greenhouse gases, again, so much focus is on CO2 and nothing on methane. And we're not talking about calflatulence. We're talking about formerly frozen methane deposits that are now spewing into the atmosphere. Anthony and Kev, have you two seen the blowouts called Pingos in Siberia, the methane blowouts? Have you seen those craters?
Yeah, I've been following them for quite a while, actually, Dane. They're quite horrendous.
They are. And I would hope your listeners might take a look at that as well. It's if they search methane craters Siberia, they'll be shocked at what they see. And the latest statistic, there's about 7,000 of those either having already erupted or going to erupt. And the methane expulsion on the seafloor is much worse still. So I think we need to consider that this is not about Al Gore or carbon credit shams. It's simply about real damage done to the planet, which climate engineering is making far worse, not better.
You know, Dane, one of the things that is sort of my pattern or my method to my madness is to hit the punchline at the beginning and then work backwards to support it. And so I'll cut to the chase here. Man is doing this. This is all man-made. We see the aircraft. We see the spraying in the air. We've discussed at length about the components of what they're spraying. To what end? If this is a planet inhabited by humans, and humans are involved in this activity, which seems to be self-destructive, to what end? To what purpose are they doing this? Is this, you know, if we go out into the world of woo, if we go out in the world of conjecture, is this about supporting a new race of beings? Or to be more pragmatic and perhaps more scientific about it, is this really an effort to sustain life, to somehow prevent, as they're saying, global warming, but as you have discussed at length, this rebound effect that we're caught up in an endless loop of? In short, to what end? What is their purpose in doing all of this damage?
It's a very complex answer to that question, and certainly it's the most common question people ask. If we go backward, let's look at the destructive behavior of all empires. And at this point, it would be difficult not to admit to the fact that we are being run by various empires, the U.S. empire being at the top of the list. And have they not all eventually extinguished themselves, just as all cancers do? And empire
for a little bit. So it's great having you on the air with our audience. Our audience appreciates your efforts. You're one of the very few that is truly both a deep researcher from a professional standpoint, as well as being willing to be outspoken and in essence, make yourself a target for those that don't want this information out. And you're right, it is a huge distraction. One of the things that you have been talking about that I find to be a relatively new discussion is this whole topic of CDR, the CO2 removal. And if you could, and I don't want to take away from your agenda, from your list of what you want to talk about, but if now or later on in your presentation, because we have 2 hours to just kind of relax and talk about wherever you want to go, somewhere in here I'd like to talk about what CO2 removal is, because I'm hearing that the CO2 levels actually are getting precipitously low in terms of supporting plant life.
I don't doubt that you may have seen some headlines like that, but I would probe deeper into wherever they came from, because we have so much data from so many different directions to say the contrary. For example, the nutrition in pollen that bees are uptaking is declining rapidly because of excess CO2. We have ocean ecosystems, most specifically, are becoming extremely saturated with excess CO2. Thus, we have the acidification of the oceans. We have many biomarkers, if you will, to confirm what we know must be happening, because the expellation of this gas is coming from everywhere at this point, from the forest burning to the ground, from the 4 billion gallons of hydrocarbon we burn a day. And the downstream disruption it causes when changes happen this quickly is very cataclysmic. And we have the other greenhouse gases, of course, nitrous oxide, methane. And although CO2 contents have been very much higher in the past, there's no question about that. And the planet was actually thriving during some of those epochs.
Mm-hmm.
But those came on very slowly, Anthony. And what we have now mathematically, statistically, is happening 170 times faster than any previous epoch. Nothing can adapt with this sort of speed. Nothing can adapt. So, and this is where people need to consider, we have a more stable temperature here compared to Venus, where one side of the planet is cooking, and you have shaded areas on the back, and you have this holding in of the heat because of the greenhouse gases. When you thicken that up, obviously you have to have a warmer temperature. And and to point back at the more significant aspects that are not being discussed by the entire climate science community, and this is where their betrayal of the human race is most revealed. One, we have all of academia and all of the climate science community not mentioning climate engineering, the single greatest disrupting factor, not the only destructive factor, but the single greatest disruptive factor.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back, everyone. Another week has gone by, and it's time for the Anthony Patch Show right here on Truth Frequency Radio, TFRlive.com. It does not seem like 1 week already since I was here co-hosting for Anthony Patch. I am, of course, Kev Baker. I'm the co-host for the next 2 hours, and you're all here to hear Mr. Patch and what show he has got lined up for you tonight. Remember, you can check out his work over at anthonypatch.com. And Tony, as I always do, welcome to your own show.
You're such a comedian. I can't do it without you, my friend. You're always good at bringing us on the air and working through some of the technical burps that we deal with. So this is fantastic. We have a great show lined up for tonight. We have 2 hours with one of our great friends, Dane Wigington from Geoengineering and geowatch.org. And he has some latest information that he's going to bring to us today because, like Kevin, myself, he's a deep researcher. And I will turn it over to you, Dane. Go right ahead and give us your introduction on the latest breaking news that you have from your organization.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Kev. And as we enter this particular chapter in time on our planet, there are so many converging cataclysms related to the biosphere that it's truly difficult to keep up. And you too certainly have taken note of the theater going on in the U.S. in the last week, correct? The Trump power structure orchestrated. And we have different sides of this power structure, and that doesn't mean any one of them is benign or benevolent, but the theater they create catches everybody up in this distraction, causing them to not focus on the wider horizon, which is where they need to keep their eyes. All of these other goings-on mean nothing in the bigger picture. Planet doesn't support life. That's the end of the road for all of us. So everywhere we look, Anthony and Kevin, we see collapse, ecosystem collapse, massive die-off. We have forest fires raging around the globe, grave implications from that. And so many of these roads, although anthropogenic activity has decimated the planet, and when I frame that question in a particular way, Anthony and Kev, no one can really rationally argue that. Even those that feel there's nothing wrong with the climate or the planet, when you point out to them that, can we really say we've been good stewards of the planet? The answer is obviously no. Climate engineering being at the top of the poor steward list and the epitome of human insanity, and so many of the unfolding cataclysms, we can say at minimum are being radically fueled by climate engineering.
Well, thank you for that introduction on that, Dane. Geoengineeringwatch.org is where you can find all of his research. And Dane, I've been following your work for at least 10 years now. When I used to live in Portland, Oregon, I used to listen to you very often, frequently. And I often thought, gee, I'd like to come down to Redding, California and, hang out with.
Increase over the horizon radar, weather warfare. We have the attempt to mask the severity of climate destruction that's already underway while inflicting even more destruction at the same time. In essence, trying to keep the empire expanding, trying to hide the severity of the consequences from the public for as long as possible, trying to keep business as usual, trying to use weather warfare as a covert weapon. all of these. It's a very complex answer, but ultimately, guys, I think if we relate it back to a cancer, does the cancer intend to kill the host? No, the host always dies because the cancer proliferates with no comprehension as to the consequences. It's a headless, heartless, soulless beast, as is Empire.
Let me ask you this question then. We're kind of drilling down. Where do you see the end point for humanity if these guys as humans are involved and it is self-destructive? And I think you and I have agreed on this before, that we've already reached and surpassed the tipping point because of the damage that's been done. We're kind of on this backside of the bell curve at this point. Where do you see the end point in terms of how much more can the planet tolerate, and thereby how much more can the human race tolerate before we actually face the obvious effects of an extinction level event being manifest by people dying off?
Mass die-off is already here. We have tens of millions of people dying off right now around the globe, and it's not being covered. And food stocks, crops are crashing in multiple locations around the globe. The ocean, which is a massive primary source of protein for many people in many continents, countries, we have ocean aquatic ecosystems collapsing as well. And this will accelerate radically. Once the dominoes in the chain start to fall, that unraveling accelerates rapidly. On a time horizon, Anthony and Kev, mathematically speaking, it would appear that we would have on the current course less than a decade in the Northern Hemisphere before the planet may likely not support life. And I know that's a very short time horizon. Many will roll their eyes and walk away. I challenge those people who would rather ram their heads in the sand than face reality to look at the statistics, to look at the truth, to look at the trajectory of where we are right now, the amount of species loss, current daily species extinctions. There's no question we're that close. There's no question. If we remain on this course, if collapse happens in a manner, in a totality, that alters that course and shuts down some of the destructive activity like climate engineering and other industrialized activities, we're destroying the planet at a pace that can't be comprehended. If that stopped, perhaps we may salvage something of the planet. We're in uncharted territory right now. And when I refer to other destructive behavior, Anthony and Kev, I'm talking about things like fire as a form of cancer, and all those order followers that go along with Empire are all a part of the cancer, whether actively or passively. So if we look at the motives behind this, there are many. It all comes down ultimately to the quest for total dominance. And Anthony and Kev, you guys know that there are various military documents that state quite clearly that is the goal, full spectrum dominance of planet Earth. You know such documents exist, correct?
You bring that term up, Dane, because that's actually the title that Anthony chose for tonight. And we've been doing a series of shows now, Tony, and we're building up the bigger picture of what all this full spectrum dominance, all the individual facets of that are.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. We're bringing in the computers and, particle physics and all that stuff. But tonight, Dane is bringing in the more visible part of it and the one that is more widespread. Go ahead, my friend.
Well, and for most people, what we try to do at geoengineeringwatch.org is to stick to the most inarguable, verifiable, and alarming building blocks of the issue. Because for the vast majority of the population, as you two know all too well, if the equation becomes too complex, they shut down and go about their life and walk away. And we want them to get through the door. And once people get through the door and realize this is going on, it's real, I can't escape from it, I have to face it, those that are capable will certainly go further into the rabbit hole. But back to the motives behind this and the motives of Empire that eventually lead to total collapse. And that's exactly what we have happening here. I think we all know that, with almost no exceptions, the members of the human race, except those that are living subsistence lifestyles, we're all contributing. If we're participating in the industrialized society in any way, shape, or form, we're contributing in a sense to a paradigm that was never sustainable. And those in power are certainly bear immense responsibility for helping to orchestrate this paradigm and helping to ensure the population would follow this paradigm. But if we trace back to the quest for more expansion, more industrialization, more GDP, continuing to consume nature for a profit, how long can that go on? And we have people in power who want to sustain that paradigm to the last possible moment and expand their power in every possible way. That leads to climate engineering. If we look at government documents, and we have many of those, some 750 pages long, they can all be found at geoengineeringwatch.org. They state clearly that those in power felt it was not only an option to decide where it rained too much, where it didn't rain enough, who should be drier, who should be wetter. They felt it was an obligation to some degree to intervene and orchestrate the weather. And again, it's about power and control. So when we have that kind of mentality with no regard for the consequences of their actions, even to themselves, and that's psychoanalysis bears that out with psychopathic behavior, that's a common thread. So when we have them trying to ionize the atmosphere for various environmental modification, DARPA weapons,